"Sir, step aside. You're not getting on this plane." Elijah Carter stops mid-stride, his grip tightening on his duffel bag. He lifts his gaze to meet the eyes of Captain Brent Howard, who stands firm, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Excuse me?" Elijah's voice is measured, but the weight behind it is unmistakable. The pilot exhales dramatically. "You heard me. This flight is full." Elijah glances at the near-empty boarding area, a few scattered passengers watching in uncomfortable silence. "My ticket says otherwise." "Doesn't matter," Howard shrugs. "You're not boarding." A slow breath fills Elijah's lungs, his military training keeping his temper in check. He's dealt with men like Howard before, but never at 35,000 feet. "Is there a problem here?" A flight attendant interjects, voice wavering. Howard doesn't turn. Not at all. Just ensure security protocols are followed. Elijah knows exactly what this is, and it has nothing to do with security. Elijah reaches into his jacket, pulling out his official military travel documents. He holds them up, the government seal glinting under the airport lights. "These say otherwise," he states, unwavering. Howard barely glances at them before chuckling. "And? I don't need a piece of paper to tell me who should or shouldn't be on my plane." Elijah's jaw tightens. "That piece of paper isn't a request, it's protocol." "Well, protocol doesn't mean much to me," Howard replies, voice dripping with condescension. "Neither do your medals." The words land heavy, but Elijah stands firm. He's not about to let this slide. A murmur ripples through the boarding area. Passengers shift uncomfortably, some sneaking glances at their phones. A few are already recording. A woman in business attire whispers to her companion, "This doesn't look right." A man near the gate scoffs. Maybe he did something wrong. The airline staff huddles behind the counter, exchanging uneasy glances. No one steps in. No one challenges the pilot. Elijah scans the faces around him. Some watch with quiet sympathy. Others avert their eyes, pretending they don't see. He's seen this before. Silence, a weapon more powerful than any word. Howard steps closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. "I don't care what uniform you're wearing. It doesn't change anything." Elijah exhales slowly. "What exactly do you think it changes?" Howard tilts his head, a mockery of thoughtfulness. "Well, it's not about what I think. It's about who I let on my plane." A young man holding his phone inches forward. "Sir, maybe you should—" Howard snaps. "Stay out of this." Elijah catches the shift in the crowd's energy. The tension isn't just lingering anymore. It's crackling. "So, that's how it is," Elijah murmurs, mostly to himself. Howard smirks. "That's how it's always been." Elijah meets his gaze, steel in his voice. "Not for long." A camera flash cuts through the tension. The lenses of passengers' phones gleam as they capture Elijah standing tall, ribbons gleaming against his uniform. His chest rises and falls steadily, the storm inside him contained but undeniable. Years of service, countless battles, none of it prepared him for this moment. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was all too familiar. Howard scoffs, pretending not to notice the cameras. "Look, you can stand here all day, but I'm not changing my mind." Elijah rolls his shoulders back. "Then, let's see if you say the same thing when my men arrive." The crowd stills. Even Howard's smug expression flickers, just for a second. Elijah pulls out his phone, dials a number, and speaks calmly. "Meet me at the gate, now." Howard shifts on his feet, forcing a laugh. "Calling in backup? Afraid to fight your own battles?" Elijah tilts his head. "You assume this is a fight. It's not. It's a reckoning." The words settle like a weight over the terminal. Howard swallows. Footsteps echo in the distance. Heavy. Purposeful. Elijah doesn't turn. He simply watches the pilot's confidence start to crack. And then his men arrive. "Hands where I can see them." The officer's voice was sharp, his eyes filled with suspicion. Elijah, just 12, froze. He had done nothing wrong, only walked home from the store. Yet here he was, face pressed against a brick wall, a cold hand rummaging through his pockets. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "You have to be twice as good, Elijah. The world won't be fair to you." That night, he stared at the ceiling, fists clenched. If this was the world he had to live in, then he would rise above it, no matter what. "I don't want to just survive, Mama. I want to be something more." His mother wiped her hands on her apron, eyes weary but proud. "Then you fight for it, baby. You make them see you." The military called to him. Discipline, structure. A chance to prove his worth on a battlefield where skin color didn't dictate his value. At least, that's what he believed. He enlisted the next year, determined that his future wouldn't be dictated by the streets that tried to keep him down. Gunfire rattled the night air. Elijah crouched behind cover, heart pounding. He had faced death countless times, yet the battle back home never ceased. "Good shot, Carter," his commander acknowledged. But later, in the barracks, he'd hear the whispers. They only promoted him for diversity, probably got special treatment. He had medals, ribbons, scars, proof of his sacrifice. But to some he would always be an outsider. The uniform couldn't shield him from prejudice. Still, he refused to break. Every mission, every order he executed, he made one thing clear. He wasn't here to be tolerated. He was here to lead. Years passed. The battlefield changed, but the war didn't. General Elijah Carter. The title commanded respect. His soldiers stood at attention. His orders carried weight. And yet, in airports and boardrooms and everyday life, the states remained. He walked into meetings where people assumed he was an assistant, not the one in charge. Every victory, every barrier shattered, yet the unspoken walls remained. It didn't matter how high he climbed, the world still tried to keep him in his place. Elijah had spent his entire life fighting to be seen for who he was, not what others assumed him to be. But now, as he stood before an arrogant pilot at an airport gate, he knew this was another battle. And he was ready. Elijah placed his military travel documents on the counter. The clerk, a young woman with neatly tied hair, glanced at them before her eyes flickered up to meet him. Her lips pressed together. "I just need a moment, sir," she said, fingers hovering over the keyboard but not typing. Elijah sighed, used to the hesitation. "It's all there. Military orders, business class seat." The clerk nodded stiffly but didn't move. Instead, she scanned the papers again, her brows knitting together, looking for something, anything, that would justify the unease she felt but couldn't say aloud. "Are you sure you're on this flight?" she asked, voice tight. Instead of stamping his ticket, she turned and leaned toward her supervisor. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but Elijah caught pieces of the conversation. "Are we supposed to let him through?" she murmured. The supervisor glanced over, his gaze cool and assessing. "What's the issue?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Elijah exhaled sharply, the message clear. No matter how many medals he wore, how many tours he had served, to them, he was still a question mark. A problem to be solved. Minutes stretched on. Elijah kept his posture straight, his fingers flexing subtly at his sides. The line behind him shifted impatiently. Finally, the supervisor nodded. "Go ahead, print it." The clerk forced a tight smile as she handed over his boarding pass. "You're all set, sir." Elijah took it, but the damage was done. The murmurs from the passengers, the judgment in their eyes, it had already marked him. He wasn't just another traveler. He was a question, a hesitation, a reason to pause. He pocketed the ticket and walked on, jaw tight. The TSA agent waved him aside. "Random selection. Step over here." Elijah raised an eyebrow but complied. The pat-down was thorough, too thorough. Hands pressing against his arms, his torso, his legs. They swabbed his hands, then his belt, then, absurdly, his boots. He glanced past the checkpoint. A white businessman, barely checked, breezed through. A young couple, no scan at all. Elijah inhaled sharply. "You find what you're looking for?" The agent didn't meet his gaze. Just following protocol. Elijah pulled on his boots, steadying himself. Protocol. That word, weaponized against him again and again, was just another way of saying, know your place. Elijah reached the terminal, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension. That's when he saw him. The pilot. A white man in a crisp uniform standing near the boarding gate, whispering to a flight attendant. Elijah knew that look. It was the same look he had seen before deployments, before battles, the look of someone preparing for confrontation. The pilot turned his head slightly, eyes locking onto Elijah for just a moment before shifting away. Elijah clenched his fists. Something was coming. Elijah had faced racism in 100 different forms, on the streets, in the ranks, even in command rooms. But this was different. This wasn't just prejudice. It was something deliberate, something brewing. And he wasn't about to back down. Elijah squared his shoulders, his voice measured but firm. I have every right to be on this flight. My papers are in order. You have no grounds to deny me boarding. Captain Brent Howard folded his arms, a smirk curling at the corner of his lips. I don't care what you think you have. You're not stepping foot on this plane. A murmur spread through the terminal. Some passengers watched in uneasy silence, others subtly nodding in agreement with the pilot. The tension thickened, but Elijah remained unmoved. Years of military discipline had taught him how to hold his ground. This isn't about protocol, is it? Elijah's voice was dangerously calm. You saw a black man in uniform and decided that was a problem. The pilot scoffed. You're making a scene. Elijah leaned in slightly. No, Captain. You made this a scene the moment you singled me out. From the back of the boarding line, a middle-aged man in a business suit leaned toward his companion. He's probably exaggerating. You know how they get when things don't go their way. A woman nearby sighed. Maybe the pilot has a reason. I mean, you never know these days. Elijah could hear the murmurs, feel the shifting energy. Some people nodded along, others averted their eyes. The doubt was insidious, creeping into the minds of those who might have otherwise questioned the blatant injustice. One younger passenger hesitated, then pulled out his phone and started recording. He wasn't sure if he'd post it, but something told him this wasn't right. Elijah exhaled slowly. He had fought for these people, risked his life for their freedom, and yet here he was, on trial without ever having committed a crime. You should check his ID again. A sharp voice cut through the crowd. A burly man with an expensive watch stepped forward. I mean, how do we know it's even real? Elijah turned to face him. Excuse me? You heard me, the man challenged. Plenty of stolen credentials floating around. That's enough. A flight attendant, shifting uncomfortably, glanced at Elijah's paperwork. His documents were already verified. Then what's the issue? Elijah asked, looking directly at the pilot. Captain Howard's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. Some passengers feel unsafe. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. Unsafe? Because I served my country? Because I wear this uniform? Or is it just because I don't fit your idea of who should be in first class? The air in the terminal grew heavy with unspoken truths. Two security officers approached. One, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked Elijah up and down. Sir, we need you to step aside. Elijah didn't move. On what grounds? We're investigating a complaint, the officer replied, his voice devoid of any real explanation. Elijah exhaled through his nose. Let me guess. Someone feels uncomfortable? He shook his head. This is how it always goes. A problem gets created out of thin air, and I'm the one who has to justify my own existence. The officer hesitated but stood firm. Step aside, sir. Elijah knew this game well. If he resisted, he'd be labeled aggressive. If he complied, he'd be humiliated. Either way, they'd already made up their minds about him. The whispers had turned into full-fledged conversations. Some people shook their heads in frustration, while others watched in fascination, waiting to see how it would end. Elijah felt the weight of it all, the years of proving himself, the battles fought on and off the field, the never-ending need to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for every black soldier who had ever been told they didn't belong. His voice, though calm, was unyielding. I have served this country with honor. I have bled for it. And I will not be disrespected like this. Captain Howard folded his arms. Then, maybe you should find another flight. Elijah met his gaze without flinching. Or maybe you should prepare for what happens next. Elijah pulled out his phone, scrolling to a number he rarely used but always kept ready. He pressed the call. Colonel Davis, he said evenly, we have a situation. The other end of the line was silent for a beat before a clipped, authoritative voice responded. Where are you, General? Gate 14A, Elijah replied, his tone unwavering. It seems my presence is an issue. Another pause, then, I'll handle it. Elijah ended the call and returned his attention to the pilot, whose confidence had visibly wavered. Let's see if you say the same thing when my men arrive. The terminal fell into a tense hush. The next move was no longer Elijah's to make, and that made the waiting all the more unbearable. The airport terminal hums with restless energy, but a new sound cuts through the noise. Heavy boots striking against the polished floor. Heads turn as a group of uniformed soldiers advances with precision. Their presence alone shifts the air. Elijah remains still, arms crossed as his unit moves toward him. The lead soldier, Sergeant Martinez, halts in front of him and nods. Sir, we got here as soon as we could. Everything okay? Elijah doesn't answer immediately. He watches the pilot, the flight attendant, the security officer, all of whom had doubted him. Their eyes widen, their once confident expressions faltering. The tension thickens. Martinez glances at the officer standing stiffly beside Elijah. Problem here. His voice is calm, but the steel behind it is unmistakable. The officer clears his throat. Just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. That's what they always call it. Behind Martinez, the rest of Elijah's unit forms a line. Black, white, Latino, Asian. Soldiers of every background stand shoulder to shoulder, their ranks gleaming under the terminal lights. These men and women had followed Elijah through war, through fire. They had trusted him with their lives, and now they stood as his silent testimony. A murmur ripples through the crowd of passengers. The ones who had whispered doubts now look away. A few exchange guilty glances. Colonel Carter doesn't need to prove himself. A deep voice rumbles from behind the ranks. It's Captain Reynolds, a veteran known for his blunt honesty. He already has, more times than any of us can count. Elijah's gaze locks onto the security officer. Are we still having this conversation? His voice is measured, but the weight behind it is undeniable. The crowd parts as another figure strides forward. Colonel Davis, a senior officer under Elijah's command. He's older, white, and carries the kind of presence that demands attention. He stops in front of Elijah and without hesitation snaps into a crisp salute. Sir, Colonel Davis reporting as requested. Elijah doesn't return the salute right away. He lets the moment stretch, lets the reality of it sink in. The passengers, the security, the pilot, every single doubter is now watching a white officer acknowledge Elijah's authority. Davis speaks again, voice firm. If there's an issue with Colonel Carter boarding this flight, I'd love to hear it now. Silence. The pilot, who had stood so confidently before, looked away. His fingers tighten around the clipboard in his hand. The weight of the moment presses down on him, his posture stiffening as reality sets in. He had misjudged Elijah. He had assumed. And now, in front of everyone, he had been proven wrong. The flight attendant swallows hard and takes a small step back. Elijah lets out a slow breath. Didn't think I belonged here, did you? The pilot doesn't answer. Elijah finally steps forward, his gaze never leaving the pilot's. Still think I don't deserve to be on this flight. The question lands like a punch. The pilot's lips part, but no words come. There's nothing left to say. He had made his assumption. And now, the truth stands before him in full display. Elijah doesn't wait for an answer. He turns slightly, addressing the passengers who had whispered, the ones who had doubted him. "How quickly you believed I didn't belong," he says evenly. "How easy it was to assume the worst. I've spent my life serving this country, defending its people, and still, a uniform isn't enough for some of you to see me as worthy." A hush falls over the terminal. No one meets his gaze. The murmurs are gone. The tension has shifted. The flight attendant, who had avoided his eyes earlier, steps back behind the counter, her hands fumbling with the passenger list. The security officer, once eager to assert authority, shifts uncomfortably. The passengers who had questioned him now stare at their phones, at the floor, anywhere but at him. No one speaks. No one defends their earlier doubts, because now they all know. The security officer clears his throat. Colonel Carter, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Just following protocol, you understand." Elijah doesn't smile. Don't nod. He simply tilts his head, unimpressed. "You weren't following protocol. You were following prejudice." The officer flinches. He exhales, looking for an out. "Let's get you on that flight, sir." No more delays. Elijah watches him for a beat, then steps forward. Not as a man seeking permission, but as someone who never needed it in the first place. Behind him, his soldiers follow. Their presence, their loyalty, the truth of who he is, undeniable. This time, no one dares to stop him. The airline's official statement arrives the next morning. A carefully worded apology, citing unfortunate miscommunication and internal review. Yet Elijah knows the truth. The public knows it too. Words mean nothing when the damage is already done. He scrolls through his phone, seeing countless messages of support, but also doubts, people questioning if he overreacted. He exhales sharply. "They think an apology fixes this?" he mutters. His friend Marcus, standing beside him, shakes his head. Too little, too late. The video explodes online, shared, reposted, analyzed. The world watches as Elijah is humiliated for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. News anchors dissect every moment. Activists call for action, and ordinary people flood the airline's social media with outrage. "They can't sweep this under the rug," Marcus says, showing Elijah a news clip. Elijah nods, jaw tight. They never could, but now they don't have a choice. The pressure mounts. The airline scrambles. The damage control begins. A headline flashes across the screen. "Pilot suspended indefinitely." Elijah stares at it, expression unreadable. "That's it?" Marcus scoffs. "A slap on the wrist?" Elijah exhales, leaning back. They want this to go away fast. Sacrifice one man, keep the system intact. His phone buzzes. Another journalist. Another request for an interview. He doesn't reply. He's not interested in temporary fixes. This fight is bigger than one man. Elijah stands before his troops, the men and women who have followed him into battles far greater than this. Their faces are expectant, their loyalty unwavering. "This was never about me," he says, voice steady. "This is about every person who's been told they don't belong. Every time someone was judged before they even spoke. We don't just fight wars overseas, we fight them right here every day." The room is silent, but the energy is electric. Change starts with a voice, and Elijah refuses to be silent. Elijah looks out at his soldiers. No words need to be spoken. Their stance says everything. Unwavering, unbroken, united. Marcus steps forward, nodding. "We're with you." Elijah meets his gaze. "Then, let's make sure they hear us." No more quiet acceptance. No more empty apologies. The world has been forced to look. Now it's time to make them listen. Racism exists at every level, even against those who dedicate their lives to protecting others. If you were in Elijah's place, humiliated in front of strangers, disrespected despite your service, how would you have responded? Would you have stood your ground or walked away in silence? Let us know in the comments below. Discrimination persists when voices remain unheard. This is more than just a story. It's a reflection of reality. Share your thoughts, your experiences, and your opinions. Your perspective could inspire someone to rethink their own biases and challenge the injustice around them. Awareness sparks action. If this story resonated with you, don't let it end here. Like, subscribe, and share this video to amplify the message. Let's ensure conversations about equality, dignity, and justice reach as many people as possible. Change begins with awareness. Help us spread it.